Hello, everyone. Before we get going, I'm going to be talking about a book today called The 55 Minutes, which because I traveled a bunch of time zones and across the ocean, I only brought 3 books. So I thought, well, what's the fairest way to give them away? I will do a little trivia. So I'm from Canada, and it's going to be a Canadian trivia time. Who is Canada's head of state? Not head of government, but head of state.
The king.
The Queen.
Of king.
You said the king. I heard you say the king. Great. Congratulations. Yeah, soon.
Oh, that's the end of that competition.
That hits close to the bone. Okay, how about the city with the mildest weather? So mild you can actually grow palm trees. City Victoria. Well done. Vancouver's close, but.
I listened.
And finally, the national animal of Canada.
Moose. Gopher.
Keep going. Moose is a good guess.
Bear.
No.
Elk.
Very industrious. See, it's
Beaver.
beaver. Did you say beaver? Yeah. Congratulations. The only other animal that builds structures, I think.
Joe's moving to the USA, you've got nothing to do.
So a little bit about me. I worked in a bunch of different sectors over the years. I'm currently, I have a cool title called the Complex Systems Strategist with a company called ATCO. It's a Western Canada-based company, but has about 21,000 employees. It's around, it operates in about 4 or 5 different countries. It's probably best known as the 3rd largest modular housing provider in the world. And they've taken a really keen interest in systems thinking. In fact, they financed the production of the book. But I've also worked in academia, or adjacent to academia, running an institute at a Changemaker campus at Mount Royal University, and have worked in philanthropy for about a dozen years, strategic philanthropy in the Canadian North, the far North Arctic and subarctic regions, as well as I'm originally trained as an urban planner. And in each of those experiences, I have to say, systems thinking was sort of gradually came into focus as a kind of leitmotif through all of those career experiences. So, in urban planning, the realization very quickly that cities that work best, or neighborhoods that work best, are generally those that are not planned from a command and control model, but are emergent. Similarly, in working in the far north, realizing that the dynamics of colonization, the response to colonization is largely a rediscovery of something we would recognize as very similar to systems thinking, cosmologies and approaches to governance and development that again are not command and control, that are not binary, linear, and so on. And then in the corporate setting, it's really interesting because with ATCO's interest, we really are interested in the idea of systems thinking building in corporate longevity. So it's in a sense a deeper way to think about sustainability, not sustainability from a kind of ESG standpoint, but the question is, how does a company imagine itself being here 30 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, and what do we need to do now? What capabilities do we need to bring into the company to actually respond, to have that adaptive capacity, that requisite variety, all of those features that are at least adjacent to systems thinking that build that capability. It's important to note that even though the organization is a publicly traded company, it's family controlled. So legacy is a really important feature, not just enriching shareholder value. And of course, we live certainly in Canada in a very kind of weirdly existential moment right now. And it's really easy, and a lot of politicians have said, oh, it's one guy, it's this guy who's the problem. As soon as we get rid of him, the problem's going to go away. And of course, good systems thinkers that we are, we know that that's pretty naive. So the book was inspired by this quote, or alleged quote. There's actually no proof that he ever said this, but let's imagine he did. Albert Einstein: if I was given an hour to solve a difficult problem, and in some versions of the quote, if my life depended on it, I would spend the first 55 minutes just thinking about the problem, and only the last 5 minutes solving it. But our thesis is we live in a kind of in our current kind of dominant cultural context, the incentives, the funding, the resources, the drivers, all of the motivations and rewards tend to lie in that last 5 minutes, right? So that's the strategizing and the design and the policy development and all of the action pieces. And so we thought, well, actually, there's not many good guideposts or tools to help people sort of think about, well, how would I use that metaphorical 55 minutes wisely? So this book is available, and again, ATCO feels very strongly about this. They want it widely shared, widely disseminated. So you can actually download a free PDF of the entire book at the55minutes.com. Would encourage you to order a hard copy because it's much better to have a hard copy, but certainly we wanted to make it as widely available and accessible as possible. One of the inspirations for doing this was seeing I guess a chasm between the world of learning about systems and the world of acting on systems. And we're here at a systems practice conference, so we're all kind of to varying degrees in that continuum. But we've used this metaphor, or we've kind of appropriated this idea that originally comes out of Hindu cosmology, this concept of the Vajra, which my colleague Daniela Pappy-Thornton, in her book, an earlier book she wrote on service learning, called Learning Service, so how to do service work in a learning informed way. This quote comes from that book, which is, on the one hand, learning without action is selfishness, and on the other hand, action without learning is ignorance. And so when we combine the two, we achieve something richer than either can provide on their own. Of course, the World Economic Forum's jobs report came out earlier this year, and it listed, this is employers talking about the skills they think employees need to thrive in the 21st century. Systems thinking wasn't the top skill, but it was certainly among the more frequently mentioned skills. So that's pretty significant, that employers, mainly private sector employers, are actually mentioning systems thinking as a skill. So, I mean, in a way, take a bow, because the work that you've all been doing is starting to sort of have some really mainstream penetration, and well, that's a good thing. The other origin story of the book is a competition that was designed by my co-author Daniela back when she was deputy director of the Scholl Center at the University of Oxford, where Daniela's idea was, her observation was that when you look around the landscape of student sort of social entrepreneurship challenges, they generally take the form of pitch competitions, of design sprints, hackathons, business case competitions. They're all about the solution. And so they pay often really very little attention to really understanding the problem. And so students are often in these kind of hermetically sealed bubbles of enthusiasm where everyone cheers them on, all the way up to, in some cases, global competitions. There's one competition called the Hult Prize, you may have heard of. Mm-hmm. You know, its first winning competition was something called One Laptop Per Child. Famously now a kind of flop, because it was a solution that seemed so sexy and attracted so much venture capital. but ultimately didn't work. And so this is, in a way, informally, kind of set up as an anti-HELT prize, with much less money as the purse. But ATCO, which is the supporter of Map the System in Canada and supports Canadian schools to go to Oxford, it became very interested in systems thinking from a variety of points of view. And I've mentioned some of those. Corporate longevity. They also realized, well, geez, no other company is supporting this competition globally. We actually have a pipeline to talent. This is extraordinary talent. The students who compete in this competition, generally speaking, are the best of the best. They're future CEO material, they're future premiers and prime ministers and so on. And so out of it came this book. I'm going to quickly now kind of take you through a rapid fire, like what's in the book, just a teaser. We realized that so many different professions, vocations, and life worlds are engaging or ought to engage with systems. We discovered when we created a student guide for that student competition, we only created it for students in the competition at post-secondaries. But we suddenly had phone calls from civil servants, from nonprofit executive directors, even from the private sector, people saying, hey, that student guide is really great. We use it all the time. We use it for our staff retreats, our corporate retreats. But would you be interested in doing a practitioner version of this? And so when we began this, it started its life with the very banal title, and nobody would have ever picked it up and read it, A Guide to Systems Mapping for Practitioners. And of course, we hit upon the 55-minute title much later on. But we thought, okay, many people are going to read this book from many different places of experience. People in this room, when you start reading the book, you'll be like, oh, well, there's a bunch of stuff here that I can skip over because I know all this stuff. And for others, it's brand new. For most people, it's brand new in many ways. There's others who are more familiar with the tools, who are seasoned facilitators, practitioners, for whom some of the theory might be interesting. And so what we do is we include this kind of starting point query to help you get the most out of it. And we cheekily call it an atlas because we don't really intend for it to be written or read cover to cover. That it's really meant to be something that's used as a reference tool and that you can dive into at any place in the book. There's two broad sections. The first section is what we call foundations. So, what is a system? What is systems practice? I'll zero in a little bit on that. We talk about problems in a way that tries to reveal how problems are layered and there's a complexity to problems. We try and help provide some tools for people to think about the problem that's bothering them or that's keeping them awake at night in terms of how complex it is. We put a lot of emphasis on something called avoiding solution bias, which I'll also talk about in a second. And then we talk about research techniques for systems. We talk about mapping. Should you do mapping? What's the point of mapping? Trying to demystify mapping. And so this systems practice section, these are all capabilities. Each of these have a little subsection, a little story attached to them. I'm not going to talk about these in any detail, and you know this stuff really well. However, I am going to focus in on one of them, which is systems thinking is not new. And this is maybe a little bit against the grain of this conference because we've heard some narratives over the last 2 days that systems thinking is kind of a post-World War II phenomenon. It has its roots roughly contiguous with the dawn and flourishing of cybernetics and so on. And while those frameworks, those tools, those concepts are valuable new additions and really useful in their own right, we want to emphasize that that is not the whole picture. That in so many ways, what we now call systems thinking is a rediscovery, or in a sense a reawakening, of what we believe most human societies for most of human history came naturally to them. That in many ways, in the West, in the kind of post-scientific revolution, post-enlightenment West, we've lost a lot of this way of thinking. And so when we talk a lot about the concepts, the frameworks that come out of indigenous places and spaces. So for example, there's a Mi'kmaq concept called two-eyed seeing, which bears some similarities to the duality that Ray talked about this morning, the sort of hard and the soft. It also bears uncanny similarity to, if any of you are familiar with the work of Ian McGilchrist, talking about the difference between hemispheres. So two-eyed seeing, very much one eye sees the world in a more quantized, categorized, definable, graspable way. The other seeing the world, which is, generally speaking, more of a Western way. The other sees the world through flow, through non-binaries, through non-linearities, and so on. Some of the other concepts that are adjacent here worth mentioning, Leroy Littlebear, who is a scholar at the University of Lethbridge, Blackfoot scholar, he talks a lot about relationality as being at the core of reality. And Ray actually mentioned something very similar to this morning. But it's this Xavier from Northampton yesterday. He quoted Niels Bohr, and I wrote this down. Everything we call real is made of things that cannot be regarded as real. That is a great analog for Blackfoot cosmology. The other layer of that comes in, Roy Bearchief, who orchestrated this event here, which is a human embodied illustration of a Blackfoot creation story. The story is, and he has allowed us permission to talk about it and use it in the book. The story is all of creation, everything that we know, everything that we can touch and feel, basically came into existence through a hole. Maybe that's a black hole, who knows? What happened was a giant spider was the steward of all of this and sort of spun a web where everyone is connected to this web. And so it's very similar to Indra's net, which is a story in Buddhist cosmology. But the idea is that if there's a vibration in the web, anywhere, somebody's in trouble, some organization's in trouble. The idea is if the web is healthy, others know to rush to their help. But if the web is unhealthy, of course, we have these gaps. And so it's a systems way of looking at reality that comes from a very different tradition. This is another one, Inuit Kawi Mayatuk Hangit, which is roughly translated into that which we have always known to be true. And when you read about Inuit knowledge, it is again all relational, entirely about interconnectedness. I did a workshop a couple weeks ago in Nunavut Arctic College, where the senior staff there were like, this fits like a glove. This whole systems thinking stuff, it's new to us, but it's not new to us. It fits like a glove with how we approach the world. By the way, this was an event that was we hosted a group of foundations mainly from Europe and the US to the far north. And they were really eager to talk about governance. They wanted to talk about circumpolar governance. And Mika Mike, pictured here, who's an Inuit guide and hunter, she said, and governance expert, she said, well, we're not going to talk about governance until we get out onto the land and until we eat. And so we ate a raw seal that we had freshly caught. Some of these folks were vegetarians, so it was a bit of an uncomfortable moment. But after we had actually consumed the animal, she said, now we can talk about governance. Because she said there's two ways of thinking about governance. There's the systems that we create, that we design but there's governance that's innate in our view. So where does our accountability lie? It's to the land, it's to the animals, it's to the environment. So that was a powerful, powerful kind of teaching moment. So again, hanging up your solution, we literally go through an origami exercise to, like, you write down the idea that you think is a really cool idea, everything about, and you hang it up for the duration of the workshop. We have a couple of kind of cute concepts here. This one is what we call the SOS sandwich. So basically the missing piece of the sandwich, and why we have so many empty calories when we do innovation, is that we stick with a kind of subjective bun, empty bun, and we don't take the time to try and build toward objective understanding, although we're very clear that you can never achieve objective understanding. It's a kind of asymptotic relationship. You can approach it, but you can never meet it. The bulk of the book is what we call the tools, and each of, there's 11 chapters that we've kind of structured on this, again, leaning into the 55-minute metaphor, an analog clock, if you imagine each of the 5-minute increments being a chapter with a particular question attached to that chapter, and then a whole set of tools. Now, these are far from comprehensive. You will know many of these tools. There are 30 tools that we cover in detail, but we're also very clear that each of these tools has different families of practice. And so, play with these tools. These tools aren't frozen in time. And there's many others that you'll probably think of that we have not included here, that maybe in a future edition we can. So we talk about frame, landscape, roots, origins, futures, experience, relationships, power, causality, narrative, leverage. We also talk about action, but it's only at the very end. And we only talk about action not as a guide, but simply as a way to, when you get to the action phase, to think about all of these other questions and how it ties back. This presents it as linear, and in a book is a linear technology, but we constantly emphasize that after each exploration, after each chapter, consider reframing. What the problem that you started with is highly unlikely to be the problem that you end with. So the questions here under the frame section, where do we focus? How do we set boundaries? So here are a few of the concepts here. USAID, which unfortunately, and it's interesting. The inventor of the 5 R's framework approached us and he thanked us for actually, in a sense, giving this tool a second life. And so he wants to have a whole conference around this one tool, 5 R's framework. Problem framing canvas, of course, out of Griffiths, the Griffiths Institute, which again no longer exists. Landscape. What are the contours? So this is things like basins of attraction, the topography of the system, the tipping points, and so on. There's a few tools we cover here that you'll know. Roots. What's beneath the surface? Iceberg model, for example. Origins. How did we get here? So we do some timeline mapping, both in a linear sense and in a circular, circular adaptive sense. Futures, where might we be going? Both that we did nothing about this problem, and aspirationally. So here we spend time talking about trend mapping, various kinds of S-curve and phase transition frameworks, such as the Berkana's 2 loops model. And then experience. How is the system actually experienced by those within it, or those who ostensibly are supposed to benefit from any given system? So journey maps, ethnography. Who is involved and how are they connected? The actors. Power. Who and what holds influence? And so there's a range of tools here. What causes what to do what? Of course, the logic of the system. You'll know these tools well. Narrative. What ways of thinking keep the problem in place? So high in tools is causal layered analysis, rich pictures, and so on. And where in the system might change be possible, or leverage. Here we also talk about theory of change. So again, that final kind of moment is a moment to reframe, not necessarily to act. Some may not act. Some may just walk away and go, it's way too complex. But hopefully not. And so we're at that kind of last subjective 5 minutes, which again, we talk about in some detail, but again, it's not a guide. So sorry for rushing through that. I know we didn't have a lot of time to go over those in detail. But again, please download a copy of the book. If you like it, consider ordering a hard copy. And thank you for your time.